Dust tastes like regret. Nora swallowed another mouthful of it, her throat a dry pipe scraping against itself. This wasn't the promised land. It was a sun-baked anvil, and she was the meat being pounded flat against it. Her heavy thighs burned chafed raw beneath damp calico. She dropped the dull iron hoe, watching it kick up a pitiful cloud of grey powder. "I can't," she whispered to the indifferent wind. Then a shadow fell over her, smelling of pine resin and old leather. Dirt had a way of getting everywhere out here. It lived in the creases of Nora's knuckles, settled into the deep lines of her neck, and coated the roof of her mouth like a second skin. She drove the pickaxe down again. The iron head struck a buried slab of granite with a dull, jarring clank that sent a violent vibration up her forearms and straight into her teeth. She leaned heavily on the splintered wooden handle, her lungs pulling desperately at the thin, arid air. Nora was a large woman. She had always been substantial, a fact her late brother Arthur used to say was a blessing for a farmer's sister. Bones wrap tight, but meat pulls the plough, he'd joked on the wagon ride out from Ohio. Now Arthur was buried under a cairn of the very same rocks she was trying to clear his chest, hollowed out by consumption before the first snow had even thawed. He hadn't pulled the plough. He had left it to her. She wiped a thick, grime-coated forearm across her brow, smearing the sweat rather than clearing it. The midday sun was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her dress, a faded blue cotton thing that had once fit loosely, now clung to the rolls of her stomach and the broad expanse of her back, plastered there by a cold, sticky sweat. The fabric bunched painfully between her thick thighs with every step she took across the uneven furrows. Every movement was friction. Every breath was an argument with her own ribcage. She looked at the burlap sack dragged halfway across the plot. It was half full of fist-sized stones, roots thicker than her wrists, and the stubborn, useless debris of the high plains. It probably weighed 60 pounds. To haul it to the edge of the property meant dragging it another 30 yards uphill. She bent down her knees, popping loudly in the quiet afternoon. Her fingers blistered, and wrapped in filthy strips of rag, found the rough twine at the neck of the sack. She pulled. The sack didn't move. It had snagged on a jagged root protruding from the hardpan. Nora gritted her teeth. A hot, ugly spike of frustration drove itself into the base of her skull. She yanked harder, putting the considerable weight of her hips and shoulders into the motion. The root held. The twine snapped. She went down hard. Her heavy body hit the dirt with a heavy thud, throwing up a localized dust storm. Her palms scraped against the gravel, the skin peeling back in angry red ribbons. But it wasn't the pain in her hands that broke her. It was the absolute, crushing indignity of it. She lay there on her side, a mountain of exhausted flesh tangled in cheap fabric, staring at a clod of dirt an inch from her nose. She didn't cry beautifully. The heroines in the penny dreadfuls Arthur used to read wept crystal tears. Nora heaved. Her broad shoulders shook as a raw, guttural sob tore its way out of her throat. Snot mixed with the dirt on her upper lip. She pounded a thick fist into the unyielding earth, once, twice scraping her knuckles raw. "I'm done!" She choked out, her voice cracking. "Take it back. Take the whole damned valley back." She waited for a response. Lightning. A sudden storm. Anything. But the prairie remained deaf. A cicada buzzed a monotonous, grating rhythm in a nearby patch of dead sage. The smell of her own sour body odor mixed with the metallic tang of blood welling on her palms. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the earth would just open up and swallow her wide hips, her thick arms, her failures. She was 26, solitary, massive, and utterly defeated. Then came the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the deliberate, heavy crunch of boots on gravel. Slow, rhythmic, unhurried. Nora's breath hitched. She scrambled to roll over, panic slicing through her exhaustion. Out here, footsteps didn't mean salvation. They meant scavengers, drifters, or worse. She forced herself up onto one knee, Her skirt twisted horribly around her calves, her chest heaving as she reached blindly for the fallen pickaxe. She froze. He stood about 10 feet away between her and the glaring sun. He wasn't a hero. He looked like something the mountains had chewed up and spat out. He was tall but slouched his shoulders broad under a coat made of patched canvas, and something that looked suspiciously like wolf pelt. His beard was a matted, dusty brown, hiding the lower half of a face that looked as though it had been carved from old wood and left out in the rain. He smelled overwhelmingly of horse-sweat wood smoke and something sharp like crushed pine needles and dried blood. Nora stared up at him, her hand gripping the pickaxe handle, though she lacked the strength to lift it. She knew how she looked. A bloated, red-faced, crying mess sprawling in the dirt. The humiliation flared hot in her cheeks, burning away the remaining tears. "Get off my claim!" she rasped. Her voice sounded pathetic, a rusty hinge in the open air. The man didn't move. His eyes, a pale, washed-out grey beneath the brim of a battered felt hat, drifted from her flushed face down to her bleeding hands, then to the overturned sack of rocks, and finally to the snapped twine. There was no pity in his face, no disgust either, just a flat, calculating observation. He didn't speak. He stepped forward. Nora flinched, bracing herself, dragging her heavy knees backward in the dirt. But he didn't reach for her. He walked right past her kneeling form. The scent of him was potent as he passed musk and old grease. He stopped at the spilled burlap sack. Without a word, he crouched. His movements were slow, deeply deliberate, but coiled with a terrifying amount of physical power. He didn't bother trying to retie the broken neck of the bag. Instead, he gripped the bottom corners of the rough fabric with hands that looked like leather anvils. He stood up. 60 pounds of deadweight stone and root came off the ground in a single fluid motion. The tendons in his neck corded briefly, but his face remained entirely impassive. He turned his back to her and began walking toward the edge of the property, hauling the burden she had spent an hour weeping over, as if it were a sack of dry feathers. Nora remained in the dirt, her mouth slightly open, the pickaxe forgotten in her lap, watching the stranger carry her failure away. He dumped the rocks at the property line with a violent echoing crash. Dust plumed up around his knees. Nora watched, still frozen in the dirt, as he kicked a stray root over the small ridge, his heavy boots moving with a practiced, brutal efficiency. He turned back toward her. Panic and embarrassment warred in Nora's chest. She couldn't let him catch her sitting in the dirt again. She pressed her bleeding palms against her thighs, hissed at the sharp sting, and forced her legs to cooperate. Her left knee popped loudly, a sound that seemed to carry across the entire quiet expanse of the valley. She swayed her head, spinning as blood rushed from her brain, but she locked her joints and remained standing. She frantically tried to smooth the front of her dress, a useless gesture that only smeared more muddy blood across her stomach. She felt massive, cumbersome, and entirely exposed under the flat grey stare of the mountain man as he closed the distance between them. "I didn't ask for your help," Nora said. Her voice was stronger this time, laced with the defensive venom she used to keep people from looking too closely at her. The man stopped a few paces away. Up close, the details of his rough existence were stark. His canvas coat was stiff with grease and dirt. The lines around his eyes were deep ravines cut by years of squinting into mountain blizzards. He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the sweat pooling in the collar of her dress, the heavy heaving swell of her chest, the dirt caked into her jawline. He didn't sneer, but he didn't smile either. He unslung a heavy leather-bound canteen from his shoulder. He held it out toward her. Nora looked at it, then up at his face. "I have water at the cabin." "Cabin's a quarter-mile off," he said. His voice was exactly as she expected, low, grating, like two stones grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. It was the voice of a man who went months without speaking. She hesitated. Her throat was screaming for moisture, feeling as brittle as dried tinder. Pride told her to tell him to go to hell. Survival told her to take the damn water. She reached out. Her thick, shaking fingers brushed against his rough, calloused knuckles as she took the canteen. The leather was warm from his body heat. She turned away slightly, unwilling to let him watch her drink, and pulled the wooden stopper. The water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of tin and old copper, but as it hit the back of her throat, it felt like liquid salvation. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin and soaking into the neckline of her already ruined dress. When she handed it back, she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. "Obliged," she muttered, hating the way the word tasted. He slung the canteen back over his shoulder without wiping the spout. He looked past her toward the half-cleared field. "Late in the season to be breaking this ground. It's my ground to break." Nora snapped her chin, tilting up. "The frost took the first planting. I'm trying again." "You're turning rocks, not soil. I don't need a lesson in agriculture from a drifter." He didn't rise to the bait. His calm was infuriating. It made her feel hysterical, unhinged. She wanted him to yell, to insult her size, to call her a fool, something she knew how to fight against. This quiet, imposing presence was destabilizing. He walked past her again, heading toward the spot where she had fallen. The iron hoe lay in the dust. He picked it up. He tested the weight of it in his hands, running a thumb over the dull, chipped blade. He looked at it with mild disgust. "Hey," Nora barked, taking a heavy step toward him. "Leave that." He ignored her. He stepped up to the massive, embedded slab of granite that Nora had shattered her pickaxe against earlier. He didn't swing the hoe like a farmer. He used it like a crowbar. He wedged the dull iron edge deep beneath the lip of the stone, planted his heavy boots into the dirt, and leaned his entire body weight back onto the handle. The thick wooden shaft bowed, groaning under the immense strain. Nora held her breath, expecting the wood to snap and send him tumbling into the dirt. Instead, the earth yielded with a sickening, tearing sound. The granite slab shifted, broke suction with the mud beneath it, and rolled up and over. Beneath it lay a teeming nest of pale, writhing grubs and dark, damp earth. He didn't pause to admire his work. He kicked the heavy stone loose, then bent, wrapped his massive arms around the boulder, a rock Nora couldn't have budged with a team of mules, and hoisted it against his stomach. He walked it to the pile at the edge of the field, his breathing barely changing rhythm. Nora stood rooted to the spot. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a strange, suffocating mixture of profound relief and deep resentment boiling in her gut. She had nearly killed herself trying to move that rock. It had taken him 30 seconds. He returned to the center of the field, picking up the pickaxe she had abandoned. "I can't pay you!" Nora blurted out, her voice loud in the quiet air. "I don't have coin. I don't have flour to spare. If you're looking to earn a meal, you're at the wrong claim." The man paused, the pickaxe resting casually over his broad shoulder. He looked at her, his pale eyes tracking over her exhausted, heavy frame, taking in the trembling in her thick thighs and the defensive cross of her arms over her chest. "Didn't ask for coin," he said quietly. "Then why are you doing this?" she demanded, gesturing wildly to the field. "People don't just do things out here for nothing. Not for women who look like me. Not for anybody." He held her gaze for a long moment. The wind picked up, rustling the dead sage and tugging at the frayed edges of his coat. "Looked like you were done," he stated simply. He turned back to the unbroken dirt, raised the pickaxe high, and brought it down with a thunderous strike that split the hardpan wide open. Nora stood there as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks in the west, casting long, deceptive shadows of gold and purple across the miserable dirt. She watched the muscles in his back work beneath the canvas. She didn't say thank you. She didn't tell him to leave again. She just slowly sank down onto an overturned bucket near the edge of the furrow, letting the cool evening air dry the sweat on her skin, listening to the steady, unyielding rhythm of iron breaking the earth. Dusk didn't fall in the valley. It slammed down like a cast-iron lid. One moment the sky was a bruised, violent purple, and the next, a deep, biting blackness swallowed the plains. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. Nora remained on her overturned bucket until the cold seeped through her damp calico dress and began to gnaw at her aching joints. 100 yards away, the rhythmic heavy thwack of the pickaxe finally ceased. She heard the rattle of iron being dropped into the dirt, followed by the heavy thud of boots walking toward the water pump near the side of her cabin. She didn't move immediately. Her body felt like a rusted machine, every hinge screaming in protest as she finally forced herself upward. Her knees cracked in the quiet air. The thick flesh of her thighs burned where the coarse fabric had rubbed her skin raw all afternoon. She lumbered toward the small single-room sod and timber cabin, her heavy boots dragging in the dust. A rusted tin basin sat on a warped wooden bench outside her door. In the gloom, she could make out the massive shape of the mountain man standing beside it. He had stripped off his canvas coat and the faded flannel shirt beneath it. The pale moonlight caught the sheer, shocking width of his shoulders and the thick, scarred musculature of his back. He was working the squeaky iron pump handle with one hand, plunging his head and neck under the icy rush of water with the other. Nora stopped a dozen paces away, her breath catching in her throat. She looked away quickly, a hot flush of shame warring with a sudden sharp ache in her chest. She hadn't seen a man half undressed since Arthur had grown too weak to bathe himself. But Arthur had been skeletal fragile as dry kindling. This man was built like a granite bluff. She kept her eyes firmly on the muddy toes of her boots as she passed him. Inside the cabin, the air was stale. It still smelled faintly of the sharp, medicinal tang of camphor and the sour odor of Arthur's dying days. Nora hated that smell. She struck a sulfur match against the doorframe, wincing as her torn palms protested, and lit the oil lamp on the rough-hewn table. Yellow light spilled across the meager room, a cast-iron stove, 2 narrow cots and shelves lined with dwindling supplies. Her stomach gave a violent, hollow rumble. She moved to the washstand in the corner, pouring a small measure of water from a pitcher into a bowl. She submerged her hands. The water hit the torn blisters on her palms with a searing, white-hot agony that made her bite down hard on her lower lip. She scrubbed the dirt from her knuckles, her thick fingers clumsy and stiff. She avoided the small, cracked looking-glass hanging above the basin. She knew exactly what she looked like, a swollen, red-faced, lumbering thing. She went to the stove and fed 3 pieces of dry, split pine into the belly, coaxing the embers back to life. She didn't have much. A sack of pinto beans, half a slab of heavily salted pork hanging from the rafters, and cornmeal that was dangerously close to turning weevilly. She carved off 2 thick, fatty strips of the pork, her heavy forearm flexing as she drove the dull knife through the rind. As the meat hit the hot iron skillet, it hissed and spat, filling the small cabin with a rich, greasy smoke that made her mouth water painfully. She threw in a generous handful of soaked beans and stirred it all together with a wooden paddle. She wasn't stupid. She knew she couldn't let a strange man sleep on her property without offering him food, not after he had spent the last 3 hours doing the work of a rented mule team. But offering him a seat at her table felt too intimate. It felt dangerous. She ladled a massive portion of the heavy, greasy stew onto a tin plate, piled 2 hard, dry biscuits next to it, and walked back out the door. He was sitting on the edge of the porch, his back against a support post. He had put his flannel shirt back on, but it was unbuttoned, halfway down his chest, revealing a dense mat of dark hair. He was sharpening a small pocket knife against a smooth river stone. The quiet shk-shk of steel on stone stopped when the door creaked. "Here," Nora said, her voice rough. She held the plate out. He looked at the food, then up at her face. He didn't reach for it right away. His grey eyes were unreadable in the dark. "You don't have to take it," she snapped, misinterpreting his hesitation. Her insecurities flared instantly. "It ain't a fancy restaurant, but it's hot." "Smells good," he said softly. The deep rumble of his voice seemed to vibrate against her ribs. He reached out and took the tin plate. His fingers were clean now, the dirt scrubbed from the deep cracks in his knuckles. Nora didn't sit down. She stood awkwardly on the porch, her arms crossed over her large breasts, feeling utterly exposed in the moonlight. She watched him eat. He didn't eat like a starving drifter. He ate systematically, thoroughly, chewing each bite with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He used one of the dry biscuits to wipe the tin plate entirely clean of grease. "You want more?" she asked, her tone defensive. "No." He set the plate down gently on the floorboards. "Obliged." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled pouch of tobacco. He began to roll a thin cigarette with shocking dexterity for a man with hands that large. "There's a lean-to attached to the back of the barn," Nora blurted out. The silence was making her skin itch. "Roof leaks on the left side, but the hay is dry on the right. You can sleep there tonight, if you want." He struck a match off his thumbnail. The brief flare of yellow light illuminated the harsh, weather-beaten planes of his face. He lit the tobacco, taking a slow draw. "Judson," he said, exhaling a thin stream of grey smoke into the cold air. Nora blinked. "What?" "My name. Judson." She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry despite the cold air. "Nora." He gave a single slow nod. He didn't say it was a pleasure. He didn't offer a polite smile. He just picked up the tin plate, handed it back to her, and stood up. He was a full head taller than her and broader across the shoulders than any man she had ever known. He stepped off the porch and disappeared into the darkness toward the barn, leaving behind only the sharp smell of cheap tobacco and the distinct sensation that the air around her had suddenly become very thin. Nora stood on the porch for a long time, clutching the greasy tin plate against her stomach, listening to the wind howl down from the high passes. Morning crept through the gaps in the cabin's chinking, pale and biting. Nora opened her eyes to the rough-hewn ceiling logs, and her body instantly broadcasted its grievances. Every muscle fibre in her lower back screamed a hot, tight warning as she attempted to roll onto her side. Her shoulders felt as though someone had packed them with crushed glass. She lay there for a long moment, staring at her own thick arms resting atop the coarse wool blanket. She hated this feeling, the absolute, undeniable proof of her physical limitations. Her body was a massive, cumbersome cage, and she was trapped inside it, forced to drag it across an unforgiving landscape that wanted her dead. She gritted her teeth and swung her heavy legs over the side of the cot. Her feet hit the cold floorboards with a solid, meaty thud. Dressing was an ordeal. Usually she would force herself into the tight, restrictive corset her mother had insisted she pack, terrified of letting her wide, soft flesh spread unchecked. Today she didn't have the strength to fight the laces. She pulled on a loose, heavy woolen skirt and a drab brown shirtwaist, leaving the collar open to accommodate her thick neck. She felt sloppy. She felt immense. She limped toward the cast-iron stove, expecting the familiar, depressing chill of dead ashes. Instead, a different smell hit her. It wasn't the sour, smoky odor of her cheap pine kindling. It was the rich, dark, intoxicating aroma of roasted coffee beans. Real coffee. Not the bitter chicory root she had been boiling for the last 2 months. Nora froze her hand, hovering over the iron handle of the cabin door. She pushed it open. The frost lay thick and heavy across the valley floor, turning the sagebrush into brittle white skeletons. The sky was the color of a bruised thumb, cold and unyielding. A small fire crackled merrily in the dirt ring a few yards from her porch. Judson was sitting on a stump beside it. He didn't look like he had slept in a drafty lean-to. He looked entirely in his element. A battered black enamel pot sat directly on the coals, bubbling softly, sending up plumes of that heavenly dark scent. Judson was holding her broken iron hoe across his lap. Nora stepped out onto the porch, her heavy boots clomping loudly on the wood. She wrapped her arms around her thick waist, suddenly acutely aware of her uncorseted form beneath the wool skirt. Judson didn't look up immediately. He was working a heavy iron file back and forth across the dull, chipped edge of the hose blade. The sheik scrape sound was rhythmic metallic and strangely soothing in the crisp morning air. "You're still here," Nora said. It came out sounding like an accusation. Judson blew a dusting of iron filings off the blade. He lifted his head. His grey eyes met hers, utterly calm, betraying nothing. "Soil's still hard." Nora bristled. Her chin tipped up instinctively. "I can manage my own soil." "You broke your pick," he replied mildly, his voice a low, gravel rasp that seemed to cut right through the morning chill. "And this hoe was duller than a butter knife. You were beating the dirt, not cutting it?" He set the file down on the stump. He picked up a thick piece of scrap leather, wrapping it tightly around the split wooden handle of the hoe, where she had stressed the wood. With a spool of waxed heavy thread, he began to bind the leather to the wood, pulling the stitches brutally tight, his massive forearms corded with tension. "I didn't ask you to fix my tools," Nora said, her voice tight. The defensive wall in her chest was high and thick, built from years of being looked over, laughed at, or pitied. She hated that he had seen her fail. She hated more that he was quietly cleaning up the mess. Judson didn't argue. He just kept pulling the waxed thread tight. "Coffee's boiling. Tin cup is on the rock." Nora looked at the battered enamel pot. Her mouth practically watered at the smell. She wanted to refuse out of sheer, stubborn pride. She wanted to turn around, march back into her cold cabin, and slam the door. Her heavy legs betrayed her. They carried her down the porch steps and across the frosted dirt toward the fire. She picked up the dented tin cup resting on a flat river stone. Using a rag, she carefully poured a measure of the dark, steaming liquid. She didn't have sugar, and she didn't ask if he did. She took a sip. It was strong enough to strip paint bitter and incredibly hot. It was the best thing she had tasted in 6 months. A heavy, involuntary sigh escaped her lips. Her broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Judson tied off the waxed thread with a sharp yank, snapping the end cleanly. He held the hoe up, inspecting the repaired handle. "This'll hold for the season, but you're planting too deep." Nora cradled the hot tin cup against her chest, letting the heat soak into her palms. Arthur said the seeds needed to be deep to survive the frost. Arthur didn't know mountain dirt, Judson said flatly. Nora stiffened. "Arthur was my brother. Don't mean he knew dirt." Judson stood up. He tossed the repaired hoe into the dirt near her feet. It landed with a solid, heavy thud, no longer rattling from a loose head. "You plant shallow here. Let the sun warm the seeds during the day. Water them at dusk so the moisture doesn't boil off." He reached down and grabbed the handle of the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup, without using a rag, seemingly immune to the burning hot metal. Nora stared at the repaired tool at her feet, then up at his massive, broad back, as he turned towards the fields. The internal contradiction tore at her. She was fiercely independent, fiercely protective of the only thing she had left in the world, this miserable patch of dirt. But as she watched him shoulder her heavy pickaxe, a terrifying, pathetic sense of relief washed over her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Judson paused. He looked over his shoulder. The morning light caught the deep, rugged lines of his face. He looked at her uncorseted heavy frame, standing stubbornly in the frost. "Seen a lot of things die out here because they were too stubborn to bend," he said quietly. "You ain't dead yet." He turned and walked toward the unploughed furrows. Nora stood by the fire, the hot coffee burning her tongue, and listened to the sound of iron breaking the earth. Blisters turned to hard yellow ridges on the pads of Nora's palms over the next 2 weeks. The rhythm of their days settled into a brutal, unspoken agreement. Judson slept in the drafty lean-to, waking before dawn to boil that black, bitter coffee. Nora woke to the sound of his axe splitting pine, her body a canvas of deep, throbbing aches that she stubbornly ignored. They worked the stubborn earth side by side. He took the heavy braking plough, driving it through the crust of the valley floor, while she followed behind with the repaired hoe, breaking the massive clods into something resembling soil. They rarely spoke. Silence was a physical entity between them, thick as the dust that coated their clothes. Nora hated the heat of noon most of all. By midday the sun was a white-hot hammer. Her heavy woolen skirt felt like a lead blanket dragging at her waist. Beneath her cotton shirtwaist sweat pooled in the deep folds of her stomach, and beneath her heavy breasts breeding a prickly, maddening heat rash. Her thighs chafed with every step, the raw skin burning like a lit match rubbing against sandpaper. She refused to stop before he did. It was a stupid, stubborn pride born of a lifetime of being told she was too large, too slow, too cumbersome to be of use. She would set her jaw, ignore the burning friction between her legs, and drive the hoe down. Thwack, crunch, drag. One Tuesday, the sky was a bruised, cloudless blue. The air was entirely dead. Nora was working a patch of ground near the property line, battling a knot of wild sagebrush that had dug its roots deep into the hardpan. She swung the hoe, burying the iron edge beneath the root crown, and threw her considerable weight backward. The root held fast. Nora's boots slipped in the loose dirt. She stumbled backward, catching herself awkwardly on her left leg. A sharp, hot spike of pain shot up her knee, making her gasp and drop the tool. She stood there, chest heaving, the fabric of her dress plastered to her wide back. A wave of profound, ugly frustration washed over her. She kicked the sagebrush with a heavy boot, accomplishing nothing but stubbing her toe. "You're fighting the dirt," a low voice rasped behind her. "Dirt always wins." Nora spun around, her cheeks flaring hot. Judson stood a few yards away, a heavy burlap sack of seed slung over one broad shoulder. His canvas coat was gone, discarded by the water pump. He wore only a faded grey undershirt tucked into his trousers. Sweat had turned the thin fabric translucent across his chest, clinging to the dense slabs of muscle and a jagged silvery scar that cut across his ribs. She looked away, embarrassed by the sudden sharp spike of heat in her own belly that had nothing to do with the sun. "It won't give," she snapped, pointing a thick, trembling finger at the sage. "Roots go straight down to hell." Judson walked over. He dropped the seed sack in the furrow. He didn't bend down to rip the bush out himself the way he had with the rocks on his first day. Instead, he picked up her fallen hoe. He held it out to her handle first. "Take it," he said. Nora glared at him, but her heavy fingers wrapped around the smooth, worn wood. Judson stepped in close. He smelled like hot iron-crushed sage and male sweat, a potent, overwhelming combination that made Nora's lungs feel suddenly constricted. He didn't shy away from her bulk. He moved into her space entirely unbothered by her size. He reached out. His massive, calloused hands covered hers on the wooden handle. His palms were rough as sandstone. "You're pulling from your shoulders." He murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear. "You ain't built for that. You carry your power low, in your hips. Use your gravity." Nora's breath caught. No man had ever spoken about her body like that. Not as a detriment, not as a punchline, but as a mechanism. As leverage. He shifted his weight, his solid hip, brushing briefly against her wide, padded waist. A jolt went through her, shocking in its intensity. "Plant your feet wider," he instructed. She adjusted her stance, spreading her heavy boots apart in the dirt. "Now," Judson said, his hands still wrapping hers, guiding the angle of the hoe. "Drive it under the crown. Don't pull with your arms. Drop your center. Lean back." He stepped away, releasing her hands. Nora swallowed the dryness in her throat. She gripped the handle, mimicking the angle he had shown her. She drove the iron into the earth. Instead of yanking with her aching shoulders, she locked her thick arms, bent her knees, and let her heavy lower body drop backward. The earth groaned. The thick taproot of the sagebrush snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The bush tore free, sending a shower of loose soil over her boots. Nora stood up straight, staring at the empty crater in the dirt, then at the heavy bush lying defeated on the surface. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Judson didn't smile, but the hard lines around his pale grey eyes softened by a fraction of a millimeter. He picked up his seed sack. "Bones wrap tight," he said quietly, echoing the words she muttered to herself in her darkest moments, words he must have overheard. "But mass moves the earth." He turned and walked back down the furrow. Nora remained rooted to the spot, the wooden handle of the hoe still warm from his grip, a strange, terrifying tightness expanding in her chest. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel massive and wrong. She felt anchored. High plains weather didn't offer polite warnings. It ambushed. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that Nora's ears popped. 1 minute she was hauling a bucket of water from the pump, the late afternoon sun beating against her neck. The next, a shadow swallowed the valley whole. She looked up. The western horizon had vanished, replaced by a churning, violent wall of bruised clouds. The underbelly of the storm was a sickly, bruised green, the color of old copper and rot. A sudden, violent gust of wind hit the yard, kicking up a blinding wall of alkaline dust that stung her eyes and coated her teeth in grit. "Barn!" The shout tore through the rising howl of the wind. Judson was sprinting across the field, moving with a terrifying, predatory speed that defied his massive frame. He grabbed the halters of the 2 panicked mules, his boots digging deep trenches into the loose soil as he dragged the braying animals towards the weathered timber structure. The temperature plummeted. Nora's sweat turned instantly to ice against her skin. The smell of ozone, sharp, metallic, and electric flooded her nostrils. Nora the doors. She dropped the water bucket. The wind caught her heavy skirts, whipping the coarse fabric around her thick calves, nearly knocking her off her feet. She leaned entirely into the gale, using her substantial weight as a ballast, and fought her way across the yard. The first drops of rain hit like gravel. They were massive, freezing, and hard. Hail! She reached the massive wooden doors of the barn, just as Judson hauled the second mule inside. The interior of the barn was a cavern of sudden, dusty darkness. "Grab the left!" Judson roared over the deafening clatter of ice hammering the tin roof. Nora threw her shoulder against the rough timber of the left door. The wind howled through the gap, a physical wall of pressure, trying to rip the wood from her grasp. Her boots slipped in the dampening mud. She gritted her teeth, a guttural sound of pure exertion tearing from her throat, and drove her heavy thighs forward, putting every ounce of her mass into the timber. Judson slammed the right door shut. He dropped a heavy iron bar across the brackets, just as a violent gust of wind slammed into the outside, rattling the entire structure down to its stone foundations. Then absolute darkness. The noise outside was apocalyptic, a roaring mechanical screech of wind and ice tearing at the valley. But inside, it was suddenly intensely intimate. The air was thick with the smell of dried alfalfa, panicked mule sweat and wet wool. Nora stood by the door, her back pressed against the wood chest, heaving in the pitch black. Her lungs burned. Her wet skirts clung to her thick legs. She was shivering violently, the sudden drop in temperature shocking her overheated system. A match flared loudly in the dark. The sudden yellow light threw sharp, monstrous shadows against the barn walls. Judson held the match, lighting a rusted kerosene lantern hanging from a central post. The glow illuminated the rough planes of his face. His hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping icy water onto his collar. He turned and looked at her. Nora knew what she looked like. A drowned, gasping mess. Her hair had escaped its pins, hanging in wet, limp strands across her flushed, round face. The wet cotton of her shirtwaist clung unforgivingly to the heavy rolls of her waist and the wide spread of her hips. Instinctively she crossed her thick arms over her chest, trying to hide herself, her teeth chattering audibly. Judson walked toward her. He didn't speak. He reached into the stall beside her and pulled down a heavy, rough-spun horse blanket. It smelled fiercely of dust and animal grease. He stopped inches from her. In the confined space of the barn, his physical presence was a wall of solid heat. Nora's breath hitched, trapping itself in her throat. She looked up at him, her wide, dark eyes defensive and terrified in the lantern light. He didn't hand her the blanket. He unfolded it and draped it heavily over her shaking shoulders. His knuckles brushed the damp skin of her neck. The contrast between his burning, rough skin and her freezing flesh sent a violent shockwave down her spine. Her shivering worsened, but it wasn't just from the cold anymore. He didn't pull his hands away immediately. He stood there, his large hands resting heavily on the edges of the blanket, near her collarbones, looking down at her. "You held the door," he said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible under the drumming hail, but it vibrated straight through her chest. "I'm heavy." She choked out a bitter defensive reflex. Good for a doorstop. Judson's jaw tightened. The grey of his eyes darkened in the dim light. He leaned in just a fraction, the smell of his wet skin and sharp tobacco filling her senses, overpowering the scent of the storm. "I've seen strong men get thrown flat by a plain's wind," he said, his voice grating with sudden quiet intensity. "You didn't flinch. You planted your feet." He slowly let go of the blanket, letting his hands drop to his sides. "Stop apologizing for the space you take up, Nora." He turned away, walking toward the restless mules, to calm them, leaving Nora standing against the door. She pulled the heavy, greasy blanket tighter around her shoulders, the coarse wool scratching her chin. The storm raged outside, tearing the sky apart, but inside the dim, dusty barn, the only thing Nora could hear was the frantic, uneven hammering of her own heart. Hail battered the tin roof like a barrage of iron nails, a deafening, relentless drumbeat that made conversation impossible. Inside the barn, the temperature continued its brutal descent. The air grew so cold it hurt to draw breath, freezing the moisture inside Nora's nostrils with every sharp inhale. Judson finished checking the mules, running his large hands over their trembling flanks to settle them. He moved to the center of the barn, directly under the swaying kerosene lantern, and kicked a pile of dry, dusty alfalfa into a makeshift nest against the main support beam. He sat heavily, his long legs stretched out in front of him, crossing his heavy boots at the ankles. Nora remained by the door. She stood rigid, clutching the coarse, greasy horse blanket around her neck. Her teeth clicked together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. Her wet skirts were rapidly turning to sheets of icy canvas against her legs, drawing the vital heat out of her core. He didn't yell over the storm. He just looked at her, his pale eyes catching the yellow lamplight, and patted the hay beside his hip. Pride told her to stay standing. Fear of her own bulk told her she would take up too much space, that she would crowd him, that she would be grotesque and clumsy, trying to lower herself to the floor. But the cold was a physical blade carving into her bones. Survival violently shoved her insecurities aside. She lumbered forward. Her knees popped as she lowered her heavy frame onto the hay. She tried to leave a polite gap between them, pulling her thick thighs tight against her chest, a physically agonizing position for a woman of her size. Her lungs felt compressed. Her back throbbed. Judson sighed a rough exhalation that plumed white in the freezing air. He shifted his weight, closing the gap. His broad shoulder pressed firmly against hers, his solid hip finding the soft, heavy curve of hers. Nora flinched. She sucked in her stomach, an instinctual, desperate attempt to shrink herself, to minimize the flesh pressing against his rigid muscles. "Stop." He grunted, the deep vibration of his voice transferring directly into her ribs. "You can't hold your breath till morning. Just sit," she exhaled shakily. Her body relaxed, slumping marginally, and the sheer density of her pressed heavily against his side. He didn't pull away. He didn't shift uncomfortably. He simply leaned back against the timber beam, accepting her weight, as if she were a sacks of grain, a permanent fixture of the landscape. The heat radiating from him was immense. It felt like sitting beside a cast-iron stove. Slowly, the violent shivering in Nora's shoulders began to subside. As her eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering light, she noticed his left hand resting on his knee. Dark, thick blood was welling from a nasty gash across his knuckles, likely from slamming the heavy iron bar into the rusted brackets. The blood looked black in the kerosene glow. Nora stared at it. "You're bleeding." He glanced down indifferent. "Barked it on the iron. It'll clot." "It's full of rust and mule dirt," she argued, her voice rasping. She shifted her heavy skirts, rustling loudly in the tight space. She reached underneath the heavy wool and grabbed the hem of her cotton petticoat. With a sharp, violent yank, she tore a long, white strip of fabric free. Judson watched her, his expression unreadable. She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but his forearm tensed like corded wood as her thick, blistered fingers wrapped around his heavy wrist. His skin was freezing on the surface, but burning hot underneath. Using the corner of the rag, she wiped the worst of the grime and blood away. The cut was deep, the edges ragged. "Hold still," she muttered. She wrapped the cotton strip tightly around his massive knuckles. Her hands were not delicate. They were wide, calloused, and clumsy, but they were careful. She pulled the knot tight with her teeth, her face hovering inches from his wrist. The smell of him wet canvas-sharp tobacco, and the metallic tang of fresh blood filled her head, making her pulse hammer an uneven rhythm against her throat. When she finished, she didn't immediately let go. Her thumbs rested on the back of his hand, feeling the heavy, thick veins tracing over his bones. She felt a tremor run through his arm. She looked up. His face was mere inches from hers. The storm raged outside, screaming against the timber, but the silence between them was deafening. He was looking at her mouth. Not with pity, not with the polite, averted gaze of the townsfolk back in Ohio. It was a dark, heavy, consuming look. Panic flared in her chest. She dropped his hand and jerked backward, her wide back hitting the rough timber beam hard enough to rattle her teeth. She pulled the horse blanket up to her chin, her breathing shallow and frantic, staring straight ahead at the opposite wall of the stall. Judson didn't pursue her. He didn't say a word. He just flexed his newly bound hand, leaned his head back against the wood, and closed his eyes. Nora sat there for hours, her heart a trapped bird in her chest, listening to the ice turn to heavy, driving rain, hyper-aware of the steady, deep rhythm of the mountain man breathing beside her. Morning broke with a brutal, blinding clarity. The storm had blown itself out hours before dawn, leaving behind a silence so profound it made Nora's ears ring. She woke with a sharp gasp, her neck locked in a vicious cramp. The kerosene lantern had burned out. Pale grey light filtered through the cracks in the barn siding. She was slouched heavily to her right, her cheek resting against a solid, unyielding surface. She blinked, her bleary eyes focusing on coarse, dried mud and grey wool. She was completely plastered against Judson's side. Her thick arm was slung across his stomach, and her heavy thigh was wedged firmly against his. He was awake. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at the barn doors, letting her use him as a mattress. Nora scrambled backward with a choked, undignified noise. Her boots scrambled for purchase in the hay. She felt her face burn with a heat that rivaled the midsummer sun. I fell asleep," she stammered frantically, trying to smooth her wildly tangled hair and straighten her violently wrinkled, dirt-caked skirts. Judson stood up slowly. His joints cracked loudly in the cold air. He didn't look flustered. He stretched his massive arms over his head, his chest expanding against his undershirt, drawing the fabric tight across his ribs. "Rain stopped," he said softly, his voice thick with sleep. He walked to the heavy timber doors and lifted the iron bar. Nora stood up, her entire body aching, and joined him at the door. Together they pushed. The hinges screamed in protest as the heavy wood swung open, revealing the aftermath. The yard was a wreck. Shredded sagebrush littered the mud. The water barrel had tipped over freezing solid in the dirt. A thick, sparkling layer of frost covered everything, turning the valley into a harsh, blinding expanse of white and grey under the rising sun. Nora's stomach plummeted. She stepped out into the freezing mud, her heavy boots sinking 2 inches deep, with a wet, sucking sound. She looked toward the cleared field. If they had planted deep the way Arthur had insisted, the water would have pooled in the deep trenches, drowning the seeds in a freezing, suffocating slurry of mud. But Judson had made her plant shallow. She hurried forward, her breathing ragged, ignoring the biting cold of the air against her damp skin. She reached the edge of the furrows and dropped heavily onto her knees. She dug her bare, thick fingers into the freezing mud, carefully scraping away the top layer of crust. There it was, the small, pale curve of a seed resting safely above the waterlogged hardpan, damp but entirely intact. Nora let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was a rusty, ugly noise, but it tore out of her throat with a violence she couldn't suppress. She sat back on her heels in the mud, her hands coated in black dirt, staring out across the perfectly unbroken lines of the field. It held, she whispered. Heavy boots crunched in the mud behind her. Judson stepped up to the edge of the furrow. He looked down at the field, then down at her, kneeling in the dirt, her face flushed and streaked with grime, her wide body shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Told you," he murmured. "Dirt takes what you give it, if you build it right." Nora looked up at him. The harsh morning sun hit his face, highlighting the deep, weather-beaten ravines around his eyes, the rough line of his jaw, the white cotton bandage stained with old blood wrapped around his knuckles. She stood up. Her knees groaned. She was a mess. She was heavy, filthy, and entirely unpolished. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care. She had held the door. She had planted the field. She had survived. She didn't step back when he turned to face her. Judson looked at her. His gaze dropped from her dark eyes down to her chapped, trembling lips. The air between them suddenly felt suffocatingly thick, heavier than the plain's mud. He didn't offer a polite smile. He didn't speak. He stepped into her space. It wasn't a graceful, sweeping gesture from a dime novel. It was sudden, hungry, and rough. His large, calloused hand came up, grasping the back of her thick neck, his fingers tangling in her messy hair. He pulled her forward. Nora gasped, her hands flying up to brace against his chest, her muddy fingers clutching the fabric of his undershirt. He kissed her. It was a collision of teeth and chapped skin. It tasted of stale, coffee-sharp tobacco and the metallic bite of adrenaline. He didn't try to coax her. He simply took his mouth slanting heavily over hers. Nora's knees nearly buckled. A hot, liquid shockwave tore through her belly. She kissed him back fiercely, awkwardly, a lifetime of suppressed want, erupting in a single, uncoordinated motion. Judson groaned a low, guttural vibration in the back of his throat. His free hand dropped to her waist. He didn't hesitate. He didn't search for a narrower point. His massive hand gripped the wide, solid curve of her hip, his fingers pressing deeply into her flesh, anchoring her against the solid wall of his body. He held her like she was the earth itself, immense, unyielding, and exactly what he had been looking for. Dirt coated Nora's knuckles, but right now she only felt the heat of his skin beneath her palms. She broke the kiss abruptly, tearing her mouth away with a sharp, ragged gasp. Her chest heaved against his solid ribs. She stumbled a half-step backward, her heavy boots sliding dangerously in the wet, alkaline slurry of the yard. She expected him to laugh. She braced for the inevitable shift in his eyes, the sudden realization of what he was holding. The regret, the polite clearing of the throat that always followed when men realized they had made a mistake with her. Judson didn't move. He stood there, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath the thin, damp cotton of his undershirt. His thumb lifted casually, brushing a streak of mud from the corner of his own mouth. He looked at her. His pale grey eyes narrowed against the glaring, harsh morning sun, the sheer intensity of his stare pinning her to the spot. Nora started, her voice a dry, panicked croak. She didn't know what she was apologizing for, her clumsiness, her size, her desperation, but the habit was deeply ingrained, a reflex born of years of feeling out of place. "Don't—" Judson interrupted softly. His voice was a rasping scrape of iron, entirely devoid of judgment. He reached out. He didn't grab her waist again, but gently brushed a heavy, wet strand of dark hair from her cheek. His bandaged knuckles grazed her jawline, calloused and warm. "Don't hide." He dropped his hand, turned his broad back to the rising sun, and walked toward the barn to check the mules. Nora stood in the freezing mud for a long time. Her lips throbbed, tasting of stale coffee and raw adrenaline. Her pulse hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm in the hollow of her throat. She looked down at her hands, wide, dirt-caked, blistered and trembling. They didn't look like the hands of a delicate heroine from a penny dreadful. They looked like tools. They were ugly. But for the very first time she didn't hate them. The rest of the day was a grueling, bone-deep blur of salvage and repair. The storm had left a catastrophic mess of debris across the yard, burying the water trough in a thick layer of suffocating mud and scattering Arthur's meagre stack of chopped firewood across the property line. They worked in silence, but the quality of it had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of two strangers circling each other, waiting for the other to break. It was the synchronized, humming silence of a machine finding its rhythm. When Nora struggled to lift a waterlogged, muddy timber from the collapsed fencing, Judson didn't shove her aside to prove his strength. He stepped to the opposite end, waiting for her sharp grunt of exertion before he hoisted his side, matching her heavy, deliberate pace as they carried it to the scrap pile. By late afternoon, the brutal sun had baked the top layer of mud into a cracked, white crust. Nora's lower back screamed. Her thighs burned with a familiar, angry friction that threatened to peel the skin raw, but the crushing, breathless exhaustion that used to accompany the pain was entirely absent. She felt solid. She felt deeply, undeniably rooted to the earth beneath her boots. Dusk brought a biting chill. She dragged the heavy iron pot inside the cabin and began peeling potatoes. The skins fell into a tin bucket with dull, wet thuds. Outside, the rhythmic metallic squeak of the water pump echoed across the empty yard. Usually Judson would wash up, take his tin plate from her hands on the porch, and retreat to the draughty barn. Nora stood by the cast-iron stove, stirring a thick stew of root vegetables and salt pork, listening to the heavy, deliberate tread of his boots on the wooden planks. The door hinges groaned loudly. Nora turned the wooden spoon gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hand. Judson ducked his head to clear the low timber doorframe. He had washed the grime from his face and neck, his dark hair slicked back and dripping icy water onto the collar of his dry flannel shirt. He carried the battered enamel coffee pot in one hand and his heavy canvas coat in the other. He didn't stop at the threshold. He walked directly into the small, cramped room. He hung his coat on the rusted square nail beside the door, the exact nail that had held Arthur's coat for 6 long, dying months. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She watched him move to the small, rough-hewn table. He pulled out the second wooden chair, the one that had sat empty since the winter thaw, and sat down. He stretched his long legs out beneath the table, the cramped space forcing him to angle his heavy knees outward. He set the coffee pot on the wood and looked up at her. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't offer a flowery declaration of intent. He just occupied the space, massive and immovable. "Stew smells good." He rumbled, the sound vibrating in the small room. Nora swallowed the sudden thick knot of emotion lodged in her windpipe. She turned back to the stove. Her hands shook slightly as she grabbed a heavy ceramic bowl. She ladled a generous portion of the steaming, greasy stew into it, grabbed a hunk of dense, dry cornbread, and walked to the table. She set the bowl in front of him. Then, instead of retreating to the stove to eat, standing up in the shadows, as she usually did, she picked up her own bowl. She pulled out the chair directly across from him and sat down. The table was ridiculously small for 2 people of their size. Her thick knees brushed against his long, denim-clad legs underneath the boards. She stiffened a violent reflex of shame, making her want to pull away instantly to make herself small and unobtrusive. Judson didn't shift his legs away. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table, and began to eat. The cabin was quiet, save for the clinking of iron spoons against ceramic and the steady crackle of the pine fire in the stove. The lingering smell of camphor and sickness that had haunted the room for so long was finally gone, replaced entirely by the scent of wood smoke roasted coffee and the sharp, clean smell of Judson's lye soap. Nora took a bite of her stew. It tasted heavily of ash and salt, but she couldn't care less. She looked across the table. Judson was watching her, his pale eyes entirely focused on her flushed face. There was no pity there. No polite disgust, only a quiet, heavy certainty. He reached across the scarred wood of the table. He didn't grab her hand. He simply laid his massive, calloused fingers over her wide, blistered knuckles, resting them there, a solid, burning weight anchoring her in place. "Tomorrow," Judson said, quietly, his rough thumb brushing a dried speck of mud from her skin. "We fix the roof, before the next front hits." Nora looked at his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. She felt the thick, heavy reality of her own body sitting squarely in the chair, and for the first time in her 26 years, she knew it was exactly enough to weather the coming winter. "Tomorrow," she agreed, her voice rough but entirely steady. That concludes the story of Nora and Judson. In a brutal landscape, where survival demands absolute grit, they found strength in each other's scars, rather than perfection. If you felt the cold plains wind and the quiet power of their bond, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our gritty, realistic Western tales. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between these two unexpected survivors? Share this video with someone who appreciates raw, deeply human storytelling where actions speak far louder than words. Thanks for listening.